Hello, my name is Rain and welcome to my channel where I discuss fantasy Formula 1 and look who I picked up on the streets.
Right, worst people to pick up on the street, hopefully. Thanks for having me on.
There are worse people to pick up. Please introduce yourself if someone doesn't know who you are.
So my name's Rob. I have the F1 Fantasy channel, Formula Fantasy Hub, and much like Rain, dabble in the world of YouTube content creation. So, game's just gone live, and I think we've got a lot to talk about.
We have a lot to talk about. Initially, my plan with us meeting up here was to be sort of a final discussion type video. Obviously, the game released, less than 12 hours ago, roughly. Yeah, a bit more, like 13 hours ago. So this is going to be more of an initial thoughts type of video. So I thought we'll, again, not much editing because obviously the setup, I'm in Melbourne for those of you who don't know. So we're just going to go through the assets, talk about what we like, what we don't like. Then we'll go through some of the changes, build some teams. I've actually created my second team now on my account. So we're going to create an entirely new team here live in front of you and just discuss it. So yeah, that's the plan. Anything to add? Or?
No, I'm excited to get into it because there's a lot to unpack.
Do you want to start with the constructors or drivers?
Quick intermission before we get on with the actual video. I'm sure you know of F1 Fantasy Tools, right? You know, the one site I use in all of my videos, in all of my live streams, and just best site for all F1 fantasy stuff, looking at optimal teams based on practice results, on just team builder, looking at past races and seeing all of the points and how many points each asset got, just on a quick one-page look without having to go through multiple menus and scrolling everywhere. That site, well, if you want to get access to their premium features, you can do so by using the link down below and using code RAIN50 at checkout for 50% off the first month of your subscription. It's like a coffee a month. It's a no-brainer if you are active in the F1 Fantasy community, and if you want to beat your friends in your mini leagues, you have to use F1 Fantasy Tools. I mean, it's the only place to be for F1 Fantasy. It is better than the F1 Fantasy site itself when it comes to showing data and showing how assets perform, in general. So if you're interested in getting the premium features on their website, use my code down below so you can let them know that I sent you there. Thank you so much. Let's get on with the video.
Let's go with the constructor.
I think constructor is the big discussion, yeah. So if you haven't watched my video that I posted earlier this morning or later this night, depending on where you are in the world, I'm still not used to being on Aussie time. I talked a lot about the constructors there and the value of the big premium constructors. And I think that's the strategy most people are leaning towards now.
Yeah, it feels like that. I think, there's some folks that are interested in Williams and Alpine because they had good testing, but constructors have always really just been like the building blocks of our fantasy teams. I'd be very surprised if that changes overnight.
Yeah, it really has. And the problem, so it's something I discussed at the start of the season or like before the game dropped, that for those premium or those budget constructors to really be an option for us, we kind of needed the premium constructors, to be much more expensive compared to their driver counterparts. And while I think they've done a really good job with the pricing this year, you can't, for example, fit McLaren, Ferrari, and a premium driver in your team, which is good. The problem is that, McLaren's 30 million and then Lando Norris is 29. So I feel like we're still in that part of last year where why would you pick Lando Norris when you can pick McLaren? For the constructors then, McLaren at 30 million is hefty.
It is. I think let's drop them in for now because I think, you talked about how good and important it is to have those top scoring teams. And I think you're always going to see Oscar and Lando in contention for podiums every week, so I think that's like a nice points floor to build on. For
sure, I think it makes sense that McLaren and Ferrari are the two super expensive constructors, because with Red Bull Racing, we don't know how Lawson is going to perform. With Mercedes, we don't know how Mercedes as a whole is going to perform or how Antonelli is going to perform. Whereas with McLaren and Ferrari, I feel like you're much safer, and like both your drivers are going to be top 5. So a lot of points will come to the constructor, and they're really good pit stop wise as well. We're going to discuss the pit stop change a bit later. But yeah, I've also struggled to go McLaren less. I saw you posted that on Twitter.
I mean, you could go without it. It's just like, are you going to bet against McLaren and Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris in the first race after what we've seen?
Not really. I think one thing that speaks against them is the rain.
Yeah.
If the race is going to rain, we saw in Brazil that their advantage in performance sort of diminished when the rain came. Most of their performance is found in those corners, and when you can't utilize that speed, that downforce that they have, they sort of get brought back with the pack. But again, sure, you can bet against Lando Norris not winning, but if Lando Norris is not up there, Piastri will be.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I guess if we start with McLaren, then where do we go from here? Because I feel as though you still want to have a good 2X driver in the slot. You can't go as
You have to have
as,
someone.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably got to be a driver from the top 14. So do you think we go to the top driver, or do we go to our second constructor?
That's the thing. It is tough, and also that's the thing with Ferrari. You cannot do this and also have. It's literally impossible to fit McLaren, Ferrari, and even the cheapest top 4 team driver, which is Lawson at 18 million. You can't afford that.
No.
So I feel like, what's your opinion on Ferrari then? Because I feel like they've been slightly overlooked. I feel like a lot of people were excited, picking Ferrari, and I'm wearing the Ferrari shirt. I want to pick Ferrari, but if you go for McLaren, you kind of can't go for Ferrari.
No, and I think that's what's interesting. Like, these guys are the highest owned constructor, Ferrari, at 36%.
Yep.
So it's like, I think people do believe that they will do well. Is part of that simply because Hamilton's joined the team.
Yep.
And there's been things said about whether or not the performance is truly reflective of what they'll get out in Australia. Yep. So I don't know if McLaren Ferrari off the bat makes sense. I think you have to go for one or the other if you want to go down one of those routes. But as you say, like, you have to then go for a Carlos Sainz as your 2X, which just doesn't really make a lot of sense.
I can see Sainz getting a good result, but then you need him to. If he has a bad race, I mean, your weekend's over.
Yeah.
And that's in a game where those swings hit so hard with DNFs already. You kind of can't go for those risks 2X picks because then you're opening yourself up for more routes to failure essentially.
So if we didn't go Ferrari, then are you suggesting we don't go Ferrari, or try and build a team with what we've got?
We can definitely go with it. I'm going to go through all of them and just talk about them.
Sure.
But they are 36% owned. What do you think? They are more owned than McLaren. Do you think that's people going like Ferrari with Oscar Piastri?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean.
Or do you think people are actually going without McLaren completely?
I mean, yeah, it's possible because McLaren are only 26% owned, and I think you can see how high Sainz's ownership is. Maybe people are expecting that Ferrari level of performance last year in a Williams, which I think looks good by comparison to the midfield, but is it going to be a top 5 car every single race week? And we saw people last year, myself included, go for V-carb in the first race of the season. That absolutely backfired. So tread kind of with caution, I think, when you're going for a midfield team.
I think interestingly now, Oscar Piastri is actually overtaking Lando Norris in pick percentage. They're both on 23%. So maybe with Ferrari being the highest picked premium constructor at 36%, maybe that is the Oscar Piastri combination. And I can see that working if you actually like truly believe in Ferrari and want Ferrari to, and Ferrari have done well at Australia. That should be said.
I think they had both drivers on the podium last year. And
they did. Sainz win,
Interesting stat I looked at yesterday was in the last 10 years, either Charles Leclerc or Lewis Hamilton has finished on the podium in Australia. So
that's interesting. And also the fact that the only driver to win a season opener here is Hamilton.
Of active drivers on the grid.
And this track is also Max Verstappen's second worst after Singapore. I saw that stat as well. But let's skip Ferrari for now, keep on the McLaren. But I think Ferrari is really interesting. I think Ferrari can be really good, but it's very much a wait for practice and see if Ferrari are going to be challenging McLaren. I don't know if they're like the 3 million drop off here. It's more of like, who do you actually want to bet your money on here?
That's true.
They're not cheap enough compared to McLaren that they're in a different category. They're still very much, you either go for McLaren or Ferrari.
It's a hard decision.
I actually think you can't go with both. I think it's literally impossible.
No, well, unless you're running like.
But that's what I mean. Like for a viable team, I don't think it makes no sense. So then we get to the other premium constructors, because that's where you kind of got to start building. If you're going a 2 premium constructor team, which a lot of people are building right now, and I do think that's probably at least the safest option initially when we don't know how budget building works or how effective budget building is going to be. It's kind of like a combination McLaren plus Red Bull Racing or Mercedes, or Ferrari plus Red Bull Racing or Mercedes, or perhaps even cheaper, Red Bull plus Mercedes. What do you think of the Red Bull Constructor? I haven't seen too many. They're only owned by 13%. I think Mercedes at 11% is also crazy, but 13% for Red Bull Racing.
Yeah, it's surprisingly low, but I think those two ownership percentages are simply because both teams have a rookie in them. And you've got Max. We know how good he is, and he's very good in the wet. Australia is going to have a wet race this weekend. He can lift that team all the way into a top 2 point scoring constructor every race weekend, as long as the other driver, Lawson this year, can get in the points. And Perez didn't do that.
Perez didn't do that, and had a lot of DNFs as well. Costs the constructor a lot of points. Did not get into Q3. Right, so even those like easy points that you would imagine those top teams banking of getting to Q3, Red Bull Racing didn't get those points because of Checo going out in Q1 a lot of the time, and then just didn't overtake, which we would expect a Red Bull Racing car to do. And again, is a rookie. I think Red Bull Racing could be a good asset, and I think a combination of McLaren and Red Bull Racing could be really strong. I don't know what you actually fit in here. Let's do the cheapest drivers available. I don't actually know what premium driver 19, you can fit with this.
You could get the two.
Yeah, you can get Antonelli or Lawson. Here's your 2x. Maybe this is something you work towards budget-wise to where you can actually like fit one of these drivers in here. Then, like if you can get a Piastri plus of this, I think that could be really strong for a while. But that's in a couple races time.
Yeah, I think like Red Bull again, hinges on Lawson being able to at least contribute meaningfully. And you said we'll probably talk about pit stops shortly, but Red Bull have always been very good in the pit stops. And
I'll keep the cheapest drivers in here just so we can see the cost cap when we change the constructors around. Let's talk about Mercedes, and I think Mercedes at 11% is probably one of the most surprising ownerships for me. I think Mercedes feels like a natural second constructor, even though they probably won't be that budget building B tier asset since the budgets have changed.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think, to the point you made earlier, that having two premium constructors with so much uncertainty around budget building, at least having that safety of points is always reassuring to me. And I think, we've got 22 million in value. We obviously can't stretch to Oscar Piastri, which many of us would obviously love to do, but George Russell, I think, still a really good option in that slot. Maybe not quite as powerful as Oscar, but we saw how good he was in the second half of last year. He had a bunch of front row starts to close out the year. He had that win in Las Vegas. Australia with the weather is probably going to be quite cool as well.
Exactly, and Mercedes get better when the temperature goes down. So the weather on Saturday is like 35 degrees sunny. Mercedes could be awful, and then the rain comes and suddenly they're up there. So George overtakes, positions gained, podium for George Russell. I think George Russell at 8% is also really surprising ownership wise for me. I would expect him to be higher.
Yeah, no, I like that.
I think he's overlooked.
Yeah, truly, I think so too, and I think Mercedes as well, 11%. Like, this is one of the first combinations of teams I had in my build, and that you could even swap out a Hulkenberg for a
you can upgrade one of the cheaper ones here.
So there is a bit of flexibility in that team, I think, and it's a nice kind of baseline if you're not trying to get too spicy off the bat.
Of course. Let's quickly discuss the C tiers then. They're not C tiers anymore. I keep forgetting that. They are budgets ones, or B tiers. It feels weird to call them B tiers.
Kick Sauber a B tier?
Kick Sauber B tier? Yeah. What do you think of these cheap constructors? Do you think they're going to be viable?
Why don't we start with the ones that aren't viable?
Okay.
Because I think they're easy to cross off. And I think the two obvious ones for me are Sauber, because we've got arguably the worst. Not arguably. It is the worst. It is the worst car.
Yep.
It'll probably be that way. And I think Racing Bulls...
Average pit stop time of 6 seconds last year.
Yeah, that's right. And Racing Bulls, again, Hadjar, not really sure what to expect. Sonoda, he's always been pretty middling in terms of a fantasy asset, so I rule them out. Haas at 7 million, I probably am not going there right away, but Ocon and Behrman as individual drivers do have some appeal, I think.
Yep. They are the... Williams is 31%, but Haas is 23%.
Yeah, so some people like them.
What do you think of Aston Martin then?
It's tough, because I think 8.5 is, I'd say, a little undervalued, but it depends on if we see the Aston Martin in the second half of last year, which was an absolute dog, or we see that Newey magic works.
Exactly.
Maybe not in the first couple races, but
Yeah.
let's say by Japan, Bahrain,
Yeah.
he's starting to fix the car a little bit, and Alonso at 8.8 is also pretty good value. So
I think
maybe, but not again.
I think
now.
Aston Martin for me is written off just because of Stroll. Like I would much rather go for an Alonso and like actually get some Aston Martin coverage with Alonso in there, and ignore the constructor. The three that are interesting at least is Williams, Alpine, and Haas, and I think I mean it shows in Aston Martin is higher than Alpine, which is surprising to me. Maybe that's just the budget constraints people have, but Williams, we spoke about this earlier when we had a coffee before recording, that I think Williams, or what could really change up like our team structures and the optimal team, is if Williams are as fast as they showed in testing and can actually bridge that gap between Formula A and Formula B. Are we going to see the top? Last year we saw, Alonso got P8 sometimes, Hulkenberg got a P6 when Perez were underperforming or someone on the top DNF'd. But other than that, even when Perez was in his worst rut of form, he kept finishing P8. It was 20 seconds between Perez and who was P7, and there was a 20-second gap down to P9. We saw that multiple times last year. If that gap is bridged and like Gasly, Sainz, Albon can actually pick up P4s, P5s, I'm not saying they're going to reach the podium, but even on a P4, P5, P6 consistent finish, they could be options. I'm just not sure early on if we are willing to risk it.
Again, I think it kind of goes back to the point we were both talking about is that budget gain early on going to be quite as
powerful,
robust and as powerful as we saw last season? It doesn't really seem like it is early on. We're going to need 3 or 4 races to really understand that.
How it works,
And look, Williams, you're right. It could be a gem, and I think a lot of people are buying into that pre-season hype we saw from them in Bahrain. Is that going to show in Australia? I don't know.
And I think another thing that I kind of just now realized, since budget building as a concept is likely not as powerful as it was last year. Again, we don't know exactly how the budget building or like price increases work yet. We'll probably have to wait until like after Japan probably to know like 3-4 races to fully know how and understand how it works. With Williams or any of these budget constructors, if you start with McLaren, Mercedes, it's super easy to just after 4 races do this and then just upgrade one of the drivers.
That's
and
true.
like sure you will have lost like what at most probably like 1.8 million in value, and that's if they've had amazing and like a shocking good start to the season and actually both drivers picking up points, being in that top 4, top 5.
That gives you 31.6. So like you could go for anyone on the list, really.
Like you could have Lando Norris plus upgrading these cheaper assets, or you could even start building something like Russell plus something else.
And then what does that get you? Like Sainz in the second.
It does get Sainz if Williams are that good, and then suddenly you're upgrading. You're upgrading.
Alonso maybe.
Exactly. Here we go.
Like
and then you can even go for Behrman and upgrade to Ocon. And
again,
if Williams are that good, this is a super easy switch on a wild card as well, and you're not losing value. Whereas on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you start without these expensive assets, it's going to be very difficult to move up to them, since they are going to be increasing more than they did last year. Last year, everything above 25 million increased at most 0.2 million. Now it looks like they quite reliably could increase 0.3 every race. So if you don't start with the premium driver, the premium constructors, they could run away from you in price, and suddenly it's difficult to fit them in, even with the cheapest assets available. Especially if you don't have them. Right? Imagine you start with something like this: Sainz underperforms, Ocon underperforms, Alonso underperforms, and then suddenly you have the 2 Haas's. Say there's a 5. Okay, we're getting crazy now, but say the Kick Sauber, both start last. There's a 5-car crash in Melbourne in the rain. Bortoleto gets 10-pointer for just increasing gaining positions in the race, and suddenly like these cheapest drivers, Behrman, Hulkenberg, Hadjar, Bortoleto, they've increased in price because they had a good race or a solid race. These medium assets like Alonso, Ocon, Sainz maybe crashed or had a bad race, so they've gone down in price. And now you're completely priced out of going from this to those premiums.
You're right.
It's way easier to trade down than to go up.
And like if you have a team like this on the screen, you're having to burn a wild card really early without really knowing the full kind of situation of the budget as well.
So I think something like this, or we're talking we're talking budget constructors in general, I think it could work.
It could.
But
just be wary.
You need to be wary. If things goes wrong, it could go really wrong. And I also think it places a lot of weight on your premium driver, like your 2X driver, to actually pick up that win.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've spread it out, you have McLaren plus Mercedes, you're gonna get a lot of points from your constructors. If you have like a George Russell and he gets P4 and a 20 pointer, it's not the end of the world. Like you still get 40 points from that. Yeah. Sure, Lando Norris might have won the race and gotten driver of the day. I don't think Lando Norris is getting driver of the day like he got last year anyway. But Lando Norris wins, gets the 40 pointer. Sure, you've lost out some points there, but the people who've had Lando Norris plus McLaren, they are not going to have that second constructor. So I think this team, or like this structure of a team, could work, but you need Lando Norris to win and get that 40 pointer. If Lando Norris is like the George Russell in our previous example of only getting 20 points, now you're super far behind.
I mean, you make a great point, because you saw Max last year go out to a really quick start, but as soon as he wasn't winning races, like Australia when he DNF'd, and then Lando in Miami and so on and so forth, the viability of having Max Verstappen as a consistent 2X option just kind of dissipated pretty quickly.
Yes.
And there was more value, as you say, to go to the two premium constructors and a DRS boost driver that, scores 20, 25 points.
Yep.
The two premium constructor build kind of props your points up anyway. So.
Yeah, for sure. And then we have the drivers. Of course, the constructors are a bit more interesting, but we still got to discuss which drivers are interesting and not. Let's start from the back, I think, because we talked a bit about the cheapest drivers, and I think a lot of people are going to be picking them. So let's just focus on them for a bit. What do you reckon about these four that a lot of people are having? I mean, look at the ownership of them.
Crazy, hey. And I think when we got the releases the day before the game went live, the Haas drivers were the ones that to me stood out as very underpriced. And I think Behrman's 60% ownership very much reflective of the kind of the value you're getting out of him.
Yep.
But if we kind of work our way upwards, I think Gabriel Bortoleto at 6 at the very bottom of the list is probably a great driver for any team in F1 Fantasy. So I really like him. And then Hadjar at 0.2 more, his ownership's even to me surprisingly more than Bortoleto, but maybe that's just simply because the Sauber is an absolute tractor. Yeah,
I think people are forgetting that you get points for being last in quali and then moving up in the race. I think Bortoleto definitely has the show qualities of last year.
For sure.
So I think Bortoleto, compared to Hulkenberg as well, I think the ownership here, and I spoke a bit about Hulkenberg being a trap. I don't think he's a trap at 6.4 million. No. If he had been like 8 million, then definitely. Yeah. But Bortoleto, if you had to, if you had budget left over after picking the premium driver of choice, the constructor of choice, which one of these would you upgrade to? Let's say Esteban Ocon, because I think he's the most common upgrade. At 31%.
Are you talking about would I upgrade over Hulkenberg or Bortoleto?
No, which one of all these four? If you had to bin one for Ocon, which one would you not want to have?
It's probably Hadjar or Hulkenberg for me. I think Hulkenberg, very reliable driver, very experienced racecraft. He had the most double-digit fantasy scores of all C-tier drivers or backmarker drivers last year. But again, like you say, maybe 6.4 isn't a trap because you know what you're getting from him as a reliable. Exactly. Even if he kind of sits around 15th the whole race, it's like not the end of the world. Hadjar's a bit more untested, and I think is a little bit of a risk, but I think just naturally because of his price, he is going to just feature in a lot of teams. So.
For sure. And with Hulkenberg too, that reliability of a driver could be a detriment in fantasy. We saw what happened to Bottas last year. I think Nico Hulkenberg, he was so good in qualifying last year, but the Haas had the race pace to sort of match that. Imagine if Hulkenberg starts putting a P12 and then the race pace just plummets in the race. He's going to be the worst fantasy asset of all time. So I would probably, if I had to pick either Hadjar or Hulkenberg, I would pick Hadjar personally and drop Hulkenberg. Although starting with 3 rookies, scary into rainy turn 1 Melbourne. But I mean, we saw Hulkenberg in the rain did not perform that well either. So.
To be fair, I think you've kind of got to make your bed in most cases where you're running at least 2 rookies. So
you're kind of forced to.
And then if you're going Mercedes as well, you've got Kimi Antonelli scoring in that department too. So we might go Hulkenberg into an Esteban Ocon, who I thought was also quite underpriced.
I think Ocon is probably the most underpriced driver this year. I'm really surprised at him being only 7.3 million.
Yeah.
Behind Magnussen, Ocon was the driver that increased the most in price last year, I'm pretty sure. I think Hulkenberg was close, but I think Ocon was the second highest. And it really showed with him and Gasly. Like Ocon had worse qualifying performances, but he took overtakes in midfield and didn't gain like that many positions, at least early on in the season. But he got a lot of those overtakes after pitting or pitting early. And we saw Alpine when they had that double podium in Brazil. They're willing to take those risks when it comes to their pit strategy, which means that Ocon. I don't know if Haas is going to do that, but when Ocon was driving like that, he had those opportunities to overtake because he was on different strategies, and I think Ocon as a driver is also willing to test a lot of these different strategies. I think he's a fantastic option at 7.3.
Yeah, I think he's really reliable. Look, I know he doesn't have that amazing reputation as a great teammate, but I think in isolation as a fantasy asset, he's been pretty evenly matched. If we look at a driver like Pierre Gasly, his former teammate for the last few years in F1 fantasy, price-wise and production-wise, Gasly, I think, is maybe a tad overpriced because of how good Alpine looked, and Haas just hit the reps and the laps in testing, and they just ran a different compound strategy.
That's what they did last year as well in testing. Like Haas looked bad. Like they were the cheap, apart from Sargent, they were the cheapest priced asset last year, and they turned out to be the best, right? So I think Haas could definitely do that this year, and I'm surprised they are priced as low as they are. Quickly, what do you think about Jack Doohan then at 7.2?
Yeah, look, I won't talk too much about Jack, but just because I just don't know what his future beyond Miami looks like. But I think if you got to choose between Ocon and Doohan, I'm choosing Ocon almost every single day of the week. The thing about Alpine is Pierre Gasly showed in testing that the Alpine actually has a bit of pace there. But that's from an experienced driver who can get a lot out of the car. Is Jack Doohan going to be someone that qualifies at the very back because he's inexperienced and maybe pick up a few positions like Hadjar, or does he just kind of sit around 16th the whole race and not really factor into a big score or a good result?
Say you upgraded Nico to Ocon and then still had money to upgrade Hadjar to Doohan, would you do it? Would you go if Doohan and Hadjar like budget wasn't an issue? Which one would you pick?
I want to say Hadjar just simply on price alone. But Doohan's kind of not a terrible driver. I just think at his price, what can you do with an extra $1 million if you went down Hadjar as opposed to going Doohan? What could you do with, or what other drivers at that price point can you get to? Is that extra $1 million unlocking options otherwise?
I think the only real option is like you go from Ocon up to an Alonso. And that's what I mean, like with that 1 million, because if you look at the premium drivers, the gaps are quite big. Like if you get an extra 1 million, you the only thing is like you can go from Max to Norris. Or Hamilton to Leclerc, I guess. But then again, I wouldn't stress too much about switching Leclerc and Hamilton. I do think they're very even. You could maybe go from a Piastri to Hamilton, but I don't even think you would do that. I would rather be on a Piastri, and then Russell to Oscar Piastri is more than $1 million. So at that point, you got a few weeks building, or it's more than one downgrade. So that's what I mean with the 1 million between Doohan and Hadjar. I do think they are closer in price than what they might actually appear to be. Now, I don't know if the team I'm going to end up with will have the budget to go from Hadjar to Doohan, but I think if I had like a spare 1.5 million after I picked my premium driver of choice and premium constructors of choice, I do think I would upgrade Hadjar to Doohan to start the season.
One other thing I will say is I think the 7.2 is probably incorporating Franco Colapinto's ultimate move into that seat. So it would just, as we saw last year, be a like-for-like swap of the driver cards, and Colapinto would be maybe 7.2 or whatever the price Jack is at that time. So maybe that's factored into his
do we need to talk about the lowest owned asset in the game, Lance Stroll? I don't think we do. I think we can just skip by him. Alonso though, 47% owned.
It reminds me of 2023 when he was at 8 million and a lot of people swooped in on him, but I think it depends on what Newey can do, as we talked about before.
For sure. Do you think he is one of those like sort of Hulkenberg where he's going to qualify highly and then the Aston Martin slow and he drops back? Or is he the one to, Max Verstappen like drag that car to places where it doesn't belong?
Well, it depends on the race pace, I think, because again, I don't really want to only trust the F1 simulations we saw after testing, but the Aston Martin race pace was dreadful. It was 10th. Looked bad. And qualifying is always going to be pretty good over a single lap for Alonso. So I'm not saying he's a trap, but I'm not saying that.
I do think he's a bit of a trap option. He could definitely come good. He is definitely at a price point where it's appealing to buy him.
Yeah, true.
If he was up where Pierre Gasly is, I don't think anyone would even consider him, right? But it's just because he's lower than Yuki Tsunoda and just slightly above the likes of Ocon. But I do think I would go for Ocon over Alonso.
I probably would too. Yeah.
But then again, it depends on what strategy you're on. If you're more of a cheaper constructor, then I think you can fit Alonso in there.
Sure.
I think Yuki Tsunoda is also way overpriced.
Yeah, way overpriced, way over-owned. I just wouldn't be going down that path when you've got Alonso and you've got Ocon.
Yeah.
Kind of
Similarly to, I prefer Ocon over Alonso. I prefer Alonso over Yuki.
Yeah, true.
I think Yuki... Would you say Yuki is the most overpriced asset in the game? Whereas, Ocon was the most lower-priced asset? I could see these two... I could see Ocon and Yuki be flipped in points, and I would probably still pick Ocon over Yuki.
Yeah, I probably would too, actually. I think Yuki.
This seems backwards to me.
Yeah, it does. I think Yuki's. Yeah, I'm not sure who's choosing to own him.
He feels like a P12 to P12 type of driver.
Yeah, well, we saw that last year. He had a bunch of P11s and P10s to start the year, where he just kind of qualified there, sat there, and came away with 7 points, 6 points.
And that was the problem. A lot of people started with RB last year because they were hyped in testing. And then they turned out to be, and especially early on in the season, he was a bit better later on. But early on in the season, he was very much that driver that just, he was P12 to P11, got 2 points, and then decreased in price. And people who started with him really was hurt by budget building options. And I think the main, what I just said with, if Ocon and Yuki's price were swapped, I would still prefer Ocon over Yuki Tsunoda.
I think that's
and I do think,
assessment.
I think Ocon is the most underpriced driver on the grid, and Yuki is the most overpriced driver.
I think that's a fair assessment. All right, we're moving into the top of the midfield.
Yeah, top of the midfield.
What's your take on these three? Sainz, Albon, and Gasly?
I think they're very difficult to fit in teams, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, 60% of people doesn't think that, but I think that's the constructor trap, right?
Yes.
If you're on 2 premium constructors, these 3 are just not options. If you're on 2 premium constructors, you can't pick them.
No.
If you are on a cheaper constructor like a Haas, Williams, or Alpine, I do think you pick one of these. Maybe even both Sainz and Gasly.
Yeah, perhaps. If
that's the strategy that you want to go with. I just don't think... I think maybe one of these 2 comes good in a race. That's the question. If you're on that type of team where you have Sainz and Gasly, do you think both of them are not going to get P5, P6 in a race? Maybe one of them can reach that amazing P6 that Hülkenberg got to last year, but both of them aren't going to be that type of driver.
No. I think the pricing's done really well here as well, because Albon and Gasly, I think they're pretty evenly matched in cars that kind of equal machinery or close to. And then Sainz is naturally going to be higher because he's won a bunch of races with Ferrari, and from what we saw in preseason testing, set some really quick laps. So I think the 60%, there's a lot of hype. As you said, earlier in the video, if he's consistently P5, P4,
he's going to be an amazing option.
He's going to be great. But can he do that every race? I mean, I'm not convinced yet, but there's a possibility.
For sure. Happen. I think they priced Albon well as well. I was expecting them to have a really wide gap, similar to Alonso and Stroll last year. Imagine if Albon had been around Yuki's price. I think he would have been super highly owned. Whereas now he's a bit too close to Sainz, where people are just riding the Sainz hype and kind of ignoring Albon. I think Gasly's super interesting. I would love to own him.
Same.
But again, at 12 million, it's really
Where
difficult.
Can you fit him in, right?
Yeah. And in that case where you have the money to fit him in, don't you just kind of automatically just have the budget to stretch for Sainz? I would rather want to go with the majority initially and then deviate, rather than okay, I'll go for Gasly, suddenly Carlos Sainz gets a P5 and 60% of people have just completely run away with it. Let's discuss the premiums then. Premium rookies, Antonelli, Lawson are the options?
For me, not right now. I think if you're going with one of these, you're either having them as your premium 2X driver, which a rookie in the first race of the season scares me a little bit.
Risky.
And if you're going with them and another premium driver, you're definitely going down the Williams Alpine route as your second constructor. So, we talked about this at coffee before. If you've got Piastri and Antonelli and you're not 2Xing Antonelli, where's the value the same way if you're not getting a constructor? So it's kind of a tough one, I think.
Especially with the I know Antonelli and Lawson are the 2 drivers that are cheaper than their constructor counterparts. So maybe there could be value there if they perform well, but then you also need them to perform well. If Antonelli gets 8th, you've wasted 10 million.
Yeah. True.
Because someone like an Ocon who gets P10 could get more points than Antonelli in 8th. I think there's not that much more to say about that.
I agree.
I think George Russell is probably the most overlooked asset in the game. I think he's going to be better than what these 8% of people...
Is he now the lowest owned driver, or Stroll?
No, Stroll is lowest at 6%.
6%
and then
too many, if
George,
you ask me.
For sure. Then it's Russell, and then it's Lawson, 8 and 9%. But I think Russell's very overlooked. We talked about him a bit before. We don't have to go into him again. I think the next thing that's interesting, we've talked a lot about Oscar Piastri being a good option to get that McLaren points. Leclerc and Hamilton, if you had to pick one.
It's 1.7 million. Like, that's not a small amount.
It's not a small amount, no.
And yet, I think the ownership percentages are identical, as you can see.
Yep.
Is there like 1.7 million more value you're getting out of Charles Leclerc than Lewis Hamilton? I think, again, they've got the prices really well done here.
Yep.
I think Charles maybe early on, just because he's comfortable with the Ferrari. He had a really good end to the season last year, fantasy-wise.
Yep.
And he was on the podium in Australia, which I can take that with a grain of salt. But Ferrari has a good record here, and a stat I referenced before. Both of these drivers have finished one of either of these drivers has finished on the podium at Albert Park for the last 10 years. So I think constructor-wise, great. I think, you mentioned Oscar Piastri as a better value option than Ferrari. Do you think that dissuades you from owning a Ferrari asset?
I think at least before seeing practice, yes. I'll give you a counter argument to Leclerc versus Hamilton, though, going with Leclerc, who's comfortable in Ferrari. Lewis Hamilton, if he gets a podium, that's driver of the day. So I think Leclerc is more comfortable in the Ferrari, so he's safer early that way. But Hamilton has a higher upside because he's new to Ferrari and he's more of a fan favorite. So if he does well, and also like last year, Hamilton versus Russell was the one who qualified quite high. Hamilton had a really poor qualifying year. If that Ferrari machinery is better than Mercedes, and like last year, it was Russell and Hamilton started multiple cars apart, finished next to each other every race. Can Lewis Hamilton replicate that in Ferrari? Be P6, P7? If I were to tell you Hamilton qualified P7 in the
wouldn't surprise me.
No, it wouldn't surprise you at all. And then you say, okay, but he ended P4 or P3. That could definitely happen.
Yeah.
And so I would honestly, even though I'm a Charles Leclerc fan, I'm also a Hamilton fan. I would pick Hamilton above Leclerc.
Fair enough. That's a very valid point. I think
even with the risk of him not being comfortable in the car.
Again, it goes back to the point. What can you do with that extra 1.7? Does it get you enough value that the difference between those two is not apparent?
It gets you Ocon over a Hulkenberg.
It does, yeah.
For sure. And then I think this is really interesting, right? Max Verstappen.
Where does Max fit in? If we have two constructors in there, what can you get? Nothing. Even if you pick the full bottom, if I'm not mistaken.
You cannot fit this.
You can't.
That's the thing.
So you can't even do the two cheapest.
You can't do the two cheapest.
So you're going for the same as Lando as well, right? You're going to have to compromise on the constructor slot to get in one of the two best drivers in the game. So
I think if you had been able to reach this, I think I would have gone for it in a rainy Melbourne.
Truly.
If I could have had the cheapest drivers available, Max Verstappen, Red Bull Racing, Mercedes, that would have been the team I went for. In a rainy, even though his track record in Australia isn't great, because Max Verstappen can just do things with the car that no one else can.
It's consistency.
For sure. He's probably the most consistent driver on the grid. Maybe Charles Leclerc can steal that title just because the car is better. Or the car is more consistent. But in terms of drivers, Verstappen is the most consistent.
I also look at his price relative to the Red Bull Constructor. It's 3.2 million more. And you're not getting pit stop points.
Exactly.
You're also not getting a driver of the day from Max Verstappen most of the time. What are you getting from him that the Constructor doesn't provide?
You need him to win. And if he doesn't, every race, and again, if he does that, amazing. You have to have him, but I don't see that happening. And he's gonna have those really good races. But again, right now at the start of the season, you can't fit him alongside two premium drivers, which means that you have to downgrade this Mercedes to something like let's just slot in Williams in here. And in this case, wouldn't you just rather go for Lando Norris?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, exactly.
It's 0.6 more.
Yeah. Even with the rain, I would prefer Norris in here. So I think Max Verstappen right now is not an option for me. I think he definitely could be later on in the season when I can fit him with two premium constructors. If the Red Bull car is better and more consistent than last year, he's still putting in podium positions places every race.
Yeah.
I could see myself getting Max Verstappen later on in the season, but I would need to have the budget for two premium constructors to consider it.
I mean, we're going on how good the pricing is. Look how good it is. Lando, Max, Charles, and Lewis, all within 17 to 23% ownership.
Yep.
It's just they've hit the nail on the head.
They really have. So props to them. Quick mention. I forgot to say this about Lewis Hamilton. the new prices, new budget, and we're going to get into talk about the changes of the game and what we think about them. The cutoff for A and B tier is now not at 25 million. It's at 20 million. Meaning that, and I think if it was still 25 million, Lewis Hamilton all the way over someone like Charles Leclerc, I think he would have been on every team almost. Yeah. Now he's not, and that cutoff is actually between George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. So, well, what do you think about the budget changes? I think the budget needed to change.
Agreed.
For sure. I wasn't expecting them to do it this year.
Neither did I, but I think it's positive, and it goes to show how good the F1 fantasy community is that they've already figured it out somehow. It, to me, feels like building budget quickly out of the gates it's not important, but you won't see as much cost cap increase in three or four races like you saw last season. And again, we were talking about this before. I do not see a world in which any team in any league has 3 premium drivers and 2 constructors by the end of the year. We might get to 2, but we certainly won't get to 3.
It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's good. There's less variance in the budget swings. Similarly, so there's one change in like how much budget assets increase by, but it's also changed that it's not based on one race anymore. It's based on the last 3. Now we don't know how that's going to work for Australia if they count the end of last year. They can't know, but we don't know. Just Australia. So maybe Australia is swingy if there's DNFs and things will start to fall. But again, if you get to the midpoint of the season and Lando Norris has a DNF, he might still increase in price just based on what he did the last 2 races. Yeah. So especially these premium assets are just never going to drop. They're going to keep going up. And these cheaper assets don't have that high ceiling of increasing 1 or 1.5 million in a race. So even those swingy races where like a Hulkenberg ends P6, you're not going to get that much budget value out of it like you did last year.
No. I think it just kind of means, at least how I look at it, until we know more about the price change algorithm, I'm going to be leaning towards reliable, consistent drivers.
I think so too. I had ideas before we learned that they had changed the budget system to like budget build hard first 3 or 4 races, use my limitless chip and that sort of strategy. But now that we don't know how it works, we think it's less powerful. We might have to go with the all reliable 2 constructor to start the season. I think the change is good.
It's great.
We'll see how it is great. We'll see how it actually works. Again, we don't know. It's probably going to take 3 or 4 races before we figure it out. To 100% certainty. For now, though, I think the changes are good, but it's unfortunate that at the start of the season we can't decide if we want to go the budget building route. I suppose.
Yeah. And I think go with your gut. Go with what I think is reliable, at least from a points basis. If there's no certainty around budget, if you want to take the risk, it could certainly pay off with a Williams or an Alpine, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with going down that route. But I'm in 2 minds as to whether or not, after being burnt by that with VCARB last year, if I want to do it again this time around.
Yeah, for sure. And then there was a few other smaller changes, to do disqualifications. We talked about that before. I don't think we need to mention it. I think it's a good change. It's not going to change that much. If your driver gets disqualified, it's still going to hurt. It's just not going to hurt as bad. So I think that's a good change. Being able to swap a driver if they're inactive between a sprint, how often is that going to come up?
Yeah.
But if it does, good change.
Yes.
The other major change apart from budget is the pit stops.
Yeah. What do you think of it?
I think it's not what I expected them to change. I thought they would change, driver of the day or fastest lap or something like that. I didn't think it needed changing. Maybe this change is good, but I don't know yet. We'll have to wait and see. And I think, similar to what I spoke of in my the video that I posted earlier this morning, the weekend preview video, I think you kind of can't look at it as like, oh, the C tier or the budget constructors are going to be better now.
Yeah.
It's more the constructors, all of them are going to be better than the drivers. And once again, Lando Norris, 29 million, McLaren, 30 million. McLaren are going to get so many more points than Lando Norris on a weekly basis.
Yes.
McLaren doesn't have to have the fastest pit stop anymore. If they have the 4th fastest pit stop, they can still pick up like a 10 points. Which is, it's massive over the course of the season, right? So I feel like it was a change to encourage picking the cheaper constructors, because the cheaper constructors are going to get more points now, but so are the premium constructors.
They're actually getting more.
They're getting more because they're better at pit stops, right? Yeah. So I think they kind of missed the mark with it, but again, I don't want to say my full opinion on it until we've seen it for 5 or 6 races, but right now, initially, it doesn't entice me into picking the cheaper constructors. The only what's the word? The thing I've had to gain from picking a cheap constructor comes from the fact that the pricing is good. It's not from the fact that they're going to get a few more points from pit stops. It's just because the pricing that they've had over the throughout is really, really impressive, really. So that's the reason I'm considering something like a Williams or a Haas. It's not because they're going to get a few extra points from pit stops.
I think it's the last couple of seasons. There's been 6 constructors that have had such low ownership or just been irrelevant. I don't think we're going to see 6 midfield constructors or budget constructors that are going to be highly owned, but it gives them another way to score points than just positions gained and overtakes. And like going down the list in the ownership, like Williams 31%, solid. Haas 23%, like not bad, but I think we will see maybe not over one race, but over 4 or 5 races, the golf in points from these pit stops from the top teams. And I think it'll become clear, whether or not after a few races, if the budget gains made from a B tier or a budget constructor outweigh the points you're getting from pit stops from the top teams. I'm not sure if that made sense, but I think we'll need a few races to really understand if a Williams or
I agree. Similarly, it's going to take me a few races to actually digest if this change is good or not. I don't think it's bad, but I think it might just be a sideways move, if that makes sense, to the previous one, because I feel like sure, it's a change to the system, but I don't think it fixed the inherent problem with cheaper constructors being bad or being, unpickable at times last season. I mean, last season they were unpickable. We'll see if they are.
Kickstarter still is.
Sure, but that's not going to change anyway. But 7% ownership.
No.
I think that's it. There's no other changes to the game. What do you think about them not changing DNF points?
I think we'll be back on the pain train for another year of DNFs.
Yep.
Look,
now you know it.
It's I think it's going to be something we just have to become accustomed to, but with the -20. But I do think it's a part of the game. I mean, I would have loved to have seen have it come down to -10, which it was in 2022 and before. But I think if we put that aside of the changes they have made versus the pricing that they've really done well, I'm happy to look past it for maybe another year, and then maybe they adjust in 12 months. But again, it's certainly not a deal breaker for me by any means.
No, and at least now, if you get a DNF, at least your budget won't be slashed as well if it's at the midpoint of the season and your driver has performed well. The only time you're actually going to lose a lot of value on your premium drivers is if they've DNF'd two times in the last 3. So if they do an Albon at the end of last year, they're probably going to fall in price. But yeah, that's about it. Pleasure having you on.
Thank you, mate.
Fun meeting up. We'll see each other at the track on Friday. Thank you so much for watching. I think that's it for now. More videos coming, of course. I'm gonna spend the entire Wednesday recording stuff, because I mean that's just the way it is when the game drops with 4 days to go. Thank you so much for watching. Any final words?
No, thank you for having me on. And good luck with your teams this week, guys.
Yes, lovely. Follow Rob on Twitter. I'll leave links and stuff in the description down below. So go and do that. If you haven't subscribed, do so, and like the video. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.